Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nidus Anarchy series. I'm your host Adam, the CIO of Nidus, and today I have Mark Creekmore with eSecurity Partners. Welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
So we've been friends now for a few years. We've been working on and off on various projects. But I really wanted to get you on because you work in a completely different world than I do. You're big in Windows, like from everything Windows side. You've been just murdering it. And I would say every time I have a question on Windows or if I need help with the Windows, I always go to you and I'm going to go for you and your guys because you're way better than I will ever be in anything Windows, especially from like the identity management perspective. So I don't want to like blow you up too big, but you want to tell me a little bit about your background and kind of how you kind of started and where you come from?
Sure. I started in the electrical engineering space many, many years ago. And then as I got into more identity, I guess it was more maybe meta directory back in the day before there were a
Yeah.
whole lot of
Oh, I
identity
haven't heard that in a
platforms.
while.
Yeah, we were doing some, Perl script based open LDAP identity back in
Wow.
the day. Um, then went to Tivoli when they purchased Access 360
Okay.
in TAM stuff.
What
And then
year was that? Do you
around
remember?
2003, when
Oh, okay.
Microsoft kind of really got on the playing field with MIS, I've been doing Microsoft stuff ever since.
Okay, so let's go back to 2003 when your main competitors, I guess, at that point would have been Tivoli from IBM. You got the Oracle. They just came out like 2004-ish. Was like was an OIM or well Accelerate. Then they got bought out and um, Sun. They were the kind of the bigger players. I would say probably the more along the lines of what was kind of the advantages of the Microsoft suite versus. I mean, there's the obvious. If you're a Microsoft shop and everything's Windows, this is the best. But what would you say, like product wise? Why was Microsoft kind of in your mind superior than the others back then?
So that's a bit of a loaded question because I would probably say in 2003 they were not superior necessarily, right? They were
Okay.
just kind of getting into the space. Um, and I think it was actually good from my standpoint. It was more of us at the time building a company in the Microsoft ecosystem. But it was actually kind of good coming from Tivoli Identity Manager, which I think at the time was probably it was a superior product to MIS at that
Okay.
time. But it gave us a good feel for what was out there and what the competitors would had, and it helped us actually bring some additional components to the Microsoft space that they didn't start out with. Really, they never really had a good web interface and SSPR capabilities and things like that until 2010.
Yeah. And then eventually the whole so then it went from MIAS to MIM or FIM
So
or what
in
was the
in
progression there?
in 2007, it went to Identity Lifecycle Manager.
Oh, ILM. Okay.
So which was kind of an MIS, P2 or something, Rev 2.
Okay. And now it's gone, right? Now they've completely changed. Now it's just Entra. What is it now? I don't even know anymore. I'm so confused with Microsoft's naming.
So in 2010, it became Forefront Identity Manager,
Okay.
and then in 2016, it was just Microsoft Identity Manager. So Microsoft Identity Manager is still around. They've
Okay.
announced end of life as January 2029.
Oh, so we still got a while.
So it's still around. There's still a lot of existing clients out there. So they've been slowly building up the Entra space, as Azure, and now kind of everything's packaged more in the Entra
Hmm.
branding to slowly, get all the pieces there, so you can start looking at, so you can basically replace some of the legacy identity management packages with everything in the web.
So is it Entra Identity Manager now? What's kind of like what's the term it's being used now for this cloud one?
So that's it's weird from a branding standpoint, and it's confusing, and I still use some of the wrong terms, but you know, Azure AD, which is kind of what, their directory service that everybody's known
Yeah.
in the cloud, is now Entra ID.
Yeah.
So, and I guess,
I just
from
want to
an
go on
IDP
record. I think that's a
standpoint,
horrible naming.
maybe it makes sense, I guess. And then really they have the Entra ID governance, and they've kind of packaged everything together under the Entra branding in the Entra Admin Center, which I
Okay.
have to say is actually pretty nice, because it's a one-stop, URL that's got all of the pieces combined now, which is nice. You don't have to hunt and peck through like the portal, the Azure portal, and some other things to find everything you need.
So you've been working with the Microsoft Identity tool since inception. It sounds like pretty much. Is that
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say I think you've got to be the leading expert in Microsoft Identity management tools. I'm just going to put that out there. So, what do companies do now? So if you're on MIM right now, are you just telling people just go ahead and stay until 2029 and maybe they'll extend support past then? Or are you trying to tell them, hey, start thinking about migrating? What's kind of your message to existing clients?
Yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at with our existing clients. Is you have to start looking at migrating. A lot of these clients, and a lot of probably other, the legacy identity packages, the Oracles of the world. These are super, super complicated packages, because they can do just about anything, right?
Yeah.
Not that you necessarily want them to, but they've been heavily modified over the years, and lots of custom workflows and custom code and things like that. And you gotta kind of change your way of thinking. You want to get the identities into the cloud, um, and worry more about what they can do when they're there, right? So
Okay.
don't put a whole lot of controls over the identity themselves, as much as, what do they have access to. By default they don't access anything. And then, make sure that you're looking at what they have access to, you're testing that access on a regular basis, those kind of things. And for large clients, that's a major undertaking. So it's going to take a lot of time to
Oh yeah.
kind of get them into that way of thinking.
So are you telling people right now to get prepared to migrate into the Entra Identity Manager kind of suite-ish thing going on in there, or are you also entertaining the thought of skipping Microsoft altogether and going for some other completely different vendor?
So I think most of the existing MIM customers that we have, they're already well into the Microsoft ecosystem.
Yeah.
So I think it makes a lot more sense for them. If you're already heavily using Azure, right, and all the things that go with Azure, and you're already licensing a lot of those things, then it may not be that big of a deal from a licensing standpoint to add in the governance pieces, the workflow pieces, to have the whole
Yeah.
thing going on in the cloud.
Do you know if any like I forget what they're called, like E5 or whatever, like those like huge all-encompassing licenses? Do you know if any of those cover the identity management piece, Entra IDM? I'm not sure what it's
So they
called.
do have, if you're in the Azure P2 space,
Okay.
they have an upgrade for the P2 space, which is actually pretty inexpensive. It's like $4 a user, and that's list pricing. So I'm sure if you have a
Yeah.
big enterprise agreement, you're going to get something a lot cheaper than that. But I think they can make a good play that if you're already in that Azure world, then the add-on for all the governance pieces is probably cheaper than even, paying an Okta, or maybe even a SailPoint, or some of those other packages.
Do they delineate between workforce and SIAM? So that's a big split now in the identity world. Is Entra doing that?
Yeah, they do, and they're trying to get, they're getting a lot more into the SIAM offerings, and the B2C space. And we have some customers that are doing more in the B2C, and some of their multi-tenant stuff even comes from the B2C world, because it helps them. They kind of combine all of your customers into a single tenant, and then manage that with some of the existing, tools that are already out there. So they're definitely doing a lot in that space. I don't know if they're necessarily a leader in that space
Mhm.
yet, but they're heading in a good direction.
Okay. And how do they have something like connectors? Like, I'm just thinking of like how all the other kind of tools work to connect to various systems for provisioning. If like let's say I don't know if I want to, Windows is normally the obvious one that we want to provision into. If we want to provision to some other directory, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, how does that kind of work? What are all the pieces involved? Let's say to get on-prem, right? If I have an on-prem directory system I want to provision into from Azure or Entra ID, sorry, how do we? What are all the pieces we have to set up to make that happen?
So they have a lot of applications in their application catalog. So these enterprise
Okay.
applications that people have kind of been using for years to do kind of the SSO into other apps, like other cloud hosted things. But now they've got additional things with your HCM system, for instance. You can put in an application and then you can provision directly from Workday or SuccessFactors or things like that directly on into your on-prem AD and your Azure AD / Entra ID. So they've made a lot of strides in that world to be able to automate the provisioning, and part of that is they have what's called as a ECMA connector,
Okay.
which has a SAML front end that installs on-prem into a directory service. So it can basically connect to anything you want. So you can do SQL and generic LDAP, and there's even a PowerShell connector. So they've come a long way to be able to connect to any of your legacy systems. And I think they would like everybody just to go all into the cloud, right, and not have
Yeah.
on-prem stuff anymore. But that's it's not really realistic right now, and most companies are in some sort of a hybrid scenario.
So that PowerShell connector, does that basically Entra IDM sending a provisioning request on-prem to some server that then kicks off a PowerShell script, or what's that one do? Do you know?
Yes. Yeah, so that's part of that ECMA framework where you have the SAML listener on-prem, and Entra just communicates with that directly based on, if you can provision someone to an app and it does SAML to that on-prem connector, and that calls the PowerShell scripts and gives the PowerShell scripts all of the information. So basically, once it's in PowerShell, you can do anything that PowerShell can connect to right at that
Wow,
point, which is basically anything.
that's interesting because I mean I remember a little while ago I was working with Oracle Identity Manager, and they had they wanted certain stuff to happen on the Windows domain controllers to add them to groups. They were doing like some entitlement provisioning, and the crazy hops that had to happen were insane. It was like OAM had to make a call to a Linux box. And then on there was a Perl script that would run and create a passwordless SSH connection into the Windows server to execute a PowerShell script to do the things that it wanted to do. It was a nightmare, and it's all custom. So when one thing breaks or you want a little change made, it was a nightmare to have to deal with.
Yeah, we've done some of that stuff with kind of top secret connectors in the mainframes
Yeah.
and things
Oh,
like that,
mainframe.
AS400s, and it was always
When are we
very
going to get rid of
difficult.
mainframe? When can we all just hold hands around the world and say we're done? We don't need a mainframe anymore. Let's get off of this stuff.
Well, I've been around for a long time, and that was going on 30 years ago, right?
Yeah,
30
it's
years
going to be
ago, we're
around
all
30
getting
years from
rid
now
of
too.
mainframe.
This is insane. So, with tying to ILM, what's Microsoft's or Entra ID's single sign-on solution? Because we know ADFS for federation. Are they just using federation for everything, or is there any type of a session-based SSO like tool that can tie to your on-prem environment?
Well, they have all the applications with the standard SSO, and they can do SAML provisioning into some of those applications. For on-prem, they do have an application proxy as well. So if you just have
Okay.
something on-prem that's just some web app that you need to get access to, you can actually add that to the app proxy in Azure or Entra. I've got to keep making that distinction in Entra, and then you can put all the tools around that. Your conditional access, where Azure or Entra ID becomes your IDP, even for all of your on-prem access.
I think we should just stop saying Entra. We're going to start a protest right now. We're just going to say Azure. They've already coined the term. We've already learned it. You can't change it. I'm sorry. I say we're going to sign the petition. No more Entra. I didn't even pronounce it. Who cares? So what about orchestration? Is Microsoft diving into the orchestration field to go up against like DaVinci, Strata, ForgeRock Identity? Like they have their orchestration tool as well. Does Microsoft have anything out now or anything in the pipeline that you know of?
I think they started more down the orchestration path with some of their endpoint stuff,
Okay.
right? So with the System Center, and but yeah, they're doing a lot of the workflow components now that are kind of front ending some of their other pieces. Like you have Power Apps, you have Azure Logic Apps. So they've got their lifecycle workflow components are kind of on front of those. And so their lifecycle workflows is more of a triggering mechanism, I
Okay.
guess, than it calls some of these other pieces. So some of the built-in triggering, they call it movers, or joiners, movers, and levers, I think, which has never been a Microsoft term, but I've been told that those are terms used in other applications. Um, so it's basically, yeah, so it's
Sure.
basically the triggering mechanism that you set up to then call. It's got some built-in things, but then if there's something it can't do with the built-in things, you can just call, Azure Logic Apps
Okay.
and do kind of anything at that point.
Do you know if they're using the SCIM protocol for like lifecycle type calls, internal, external to like third parties, or?
Yeah, so most everything that Entra communicates with is SCIM based.
Okay.
So they even have something that we've used for multiple clients, and they have a SCIM um, listener in the cloud. So if you have some system that doesn't really communicate well, bidirectional with SCIM, you can have your own um, something that your own application that's running that's pulling information from that. Maybe it's even a SQL query or something, and then you're converting it to SCIM and pushing it straight up to Azure.
Okay. Is Microsoft tying any AI into the identity tools at all?
They are. I haven't really done a lot with that,
Mhm.
but one of the things that we've actually discussed with them is being able to take all of your access management and through AI. Well, I guess I should probably back that up. I mean, they do a lot of AI in like monitoring your access, things like that.
Okay. Like risk
So
based?
yeah, it's more risk-based stuff, but they're
Okay.
they're trying to get into more of the application access environment too. And so maybe you have, 1,000 groups that are all giving you access to different things, and some of their AI tools now can take a look at all that. It's almost I would kind of equate it to the old school role mining kind of stuff that we used to do,
Oh wow.
back in the day.
I, I've blocked all that
Sorry, I'm
out.
old, and
It's
so
all
it's
suppressed. We don't talk about role mining anymore.
so it's kind of the same thing as here's all everything that's given you between the access packages and the groups and giving you access to something. Um, to have these AI tools kind of look at that and help you kind of consolidate those and maybe manage those in different ways.
Okay. And then so Microsoft had Entra ID. It was an actual, it was, I think it was in the Authenticator app. There was verifiable credentials, and they were originally calling that Entra ID, from what I remember. So I guess they scrapped that. Are they still using verifiable credentials? Is that being tied into this whole new Entra
They
ID?
they are, and it is part of the admin portal.
Okay.
The Entra admin portal. There's a verifiable credential component that goes with
Okay.
that.
Have you seen anyone adopting that in the enterprise-wide side?
I have not so
Yeah.
far. I know it's there. Haven't done a whole lot with it.
Yeah, I've yet to see anyone use it yet, so we'll see what happens. Um, so my big thing is decentralized ID, right? That's why I love talking about decentralization, self-sovereign. Um, and Microsoft, they're actually part of the DID spec, like they're one of the contributors in there. But again, I feel like they're tying it back to the whole verifiable credential and not actually being truly decentralized. But again, why would they spend a ton of money for something open that they would not be able to own and control? Have you seen anything with regards to decentralized identity? Have you played with that at all from the Microsoft standpoint?
I haven't. I mean, they allow for other IDP components because they
Yeah.
kind of have to. I mean, even stuff maybe you probably should never use, like Facebook, things like that.
Like social
Um,
logins and things.
in your Gmail accounts, they'll allow for that kind of stuff. Not really decentralized in any way, right? So they really want everyone. They want Azure or Entra ID to be your IDP, and they're even doing that mostly in the B2C space now too, right? So I was saying that earlier that they're kind of bringing those all into their own tenant as opposed to the truly decentralized ID.
Okay. So what would you say is something like cool that Microsoft is doing where it's like, oh wow, this is actually pretty neat. I haven't seen this before. This is offering a lot of flexibility or promise for the future of making identity better. Have you seen anything like that that's kind of like jumped out at you?
Um,
No.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
kidding.
I don't know if they're. I don't know if that's the thing. I don't know that they're necessarily a leader in
Yeah.
a lot of these spaces. I think and I don't want to insult anyone at Microsoft, but I always joke about them being more of a steamroller kind of approach.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I think of the Austin Powers, and the steamroller running over the guy, but they're slow and they keep moving, but at some point, here they are, and they've got all the components, and they just keep things
Yep.
rolling.
Well, I remember them when they came up with Azure, just their cloud. It was the directive had to have been from the very top. You are selling this.
Yeah,
Everyone is to go to Azure. I don't care. Get everyone on the cloud because man, those sales guys were just everything was Azure trying to get people up into their cloud, and it never made any sense to me because at the time, AWS just was murdering it compared to Azure, and it was also cheaper, it was more flexible, a lot more availability zones. I mean, pretty much in every way, unless you were an AD shop, it was better. But still, now everyone's in Azure. I mean, they. I think you're right about that steamroller effect, right? They just went out to their sales team and said, "This is what we're doing. Go make it happen. Don't sell anything else." Like I don't know if they just got crazy bonuses every time they got someone into the cloud, but now pretty much every client has Azure AD, ADFS, something going on in Azure. It's pretty well.
yeah.
Yep,
They went
Azure.
through
We're calling it
the
Azure.
cloud licensing big push, and then I think it was a year or two later they started using the consumption push because they found out that, hey, just buying the licenses isn't enough. You got to make sure people are actually using these things,
Yeah.
because once you get heavily tied in, it's not so easy to move on to something else.
So how is the licensing on the Entra ID? You said is it like it's per user? Like is it anything else tied to it? Is it literally just however many users on like a monthly if it's touched or just if it's in there in the directory or how's that kind of work? Do you know?
Yeah, it's per user per month, and there are some. If you want the users to truly be managed, like with some of the access workflows and the attestation processes, that you're going to have to pay for those users. They've got some other options, maybe for some of our clients that have people that are kind of working an assembly line or something like that, right? They're
Yeah.
not necessarily going to have a full governance license. They can get away with some of the lower end, just Azure P1 licenses, and maybe even an F1 or P1 if they need email, things like that. Some of the really more simpler stuff.
Cool. So if you had to like you've been working in the identity space with Microsoft forever and I don't know anyone that knows more than you out there. So what would you say to like clients that are interested in moving to possibly the new Entra ID? Because I've had a lot of clients hit me up and say, "Hey, what's going on with this Entra ID stuff? Should we be looking into this because we have a whatever license with Microsoft, or we're hugely tied into Microsoft. We're pushing everything into Azure, and we're sitting there telling them, oh, you should be looking at ForgeRock, you should be looking at Ping for this, or SailPoint, or whatever." And then they keep coming back. Well, what about Entra ID? What do you think? And my answer has always been, I don't know. It's one, it's new, and two, it's built off the legacy, MIM, FIM, whatever all the acronyms were, and I've never really touched them too much. So, what would you say to someone that's kind of looking for across the board? They're kind of open, but they really want to know more about Entra ID.
Yeah, so if you're already in that ecosystem and you've already got a lot of the licensing, you should look at what the upcharge is going to be for your clients. What actually you need to do, and then if you're paying a big legacy vendor a lot of money,
Yeah.
it might actually be a cheaper option for you, as long as it does everything you need, and you don't find like one deal killer that doesn't allow you something that it doesn't
So,
do.
what are some of the shortcomings that you've seen?
Um, it's a lot of there's companies that want to do some things that maybe they shouldn't be doing anymore. Some of the group management components from the end user standpoint. So from an admin standpoint, it's pretty easy to do dynamic groups,
Yeah.
distribution lists. Now they've got M365 groups. They're kind of pushing everybody more toward the M365 group standpoint,
Yeah.
especially from an end user standpoint. So there are companies that they still want to do, classic dynamic groups, and there's you've got the Entra Admin Center, but users themselves usually go to much more simplified interface. So there's a My Groups portal and a My Access portal and a My Apps portal that are all kind of tied together that are end user facing. And there's still some functionality that is lacking in
Okay.
those portals. You don't
So
necessarily want to get end users to the whole full admin center, right? You just want them
if
to.
if you had the direct line and connection, the ear to the product owner, director, manager of Entra ID that's coming out, or maybe you do, I don't even know. What would you tell them? Like, hey, look, these are the things you need to add, or what would be awesome is if you did X, Y, and Z. What would you recommend to them to kind of make the product better for what you've seen and what client kind of requirements have been?
I think the group management piece is a big one from an end user standpoint. There's also some attestation components, which I think they've come a long way in
Okay.
that world. Um, with all the access review pieces, I wish there was a better automated way to apply those.
Okay.
There are some things you can do it with workflow, and you can set up some default things and apply them. But some, especially the big clients, they have a pretty big access review world, right? And they might want some special things in certain circumstances that maybe we could auto apply, based on the ownership or things like that, or based on something about the group itself or the access package itself, as opposed to going in and kind of setting these all up
Yeah.
separately under special circumstances.
So with your company, eSecurity Partners, you focus on more like implementation, architecture. What's kind of like your kind of special sauce over there? What do you like doing the most for in helping out your clients?
So we're a professional services company. So that's for the most part, we're doing the big implementations for all of
Okay.
these.
What have you seen has been kind of in the past, let's say 3 years, the trend from clients in this Microsoft world that you've kind of seen them going to?
Well, I think everybody is looking at what's next, right? Especially if
Yeah.
you're in the MIM space. Microsoft initially announced, I think it was 2026 end of life, and everybody panicked, and so they moved it to 2029, and who knows if they'll move it again in a couple of years or not. But I think that's been the hard thing is everybody's like, okay, we gotta worry what's next. Now we have a little bit of breathing room, but
Yeah.
everybody's looking at moving on.
Cool. So what do you like doing? If you had a dream client come to you, like what would be the perfect client if they said, "Hey, eSecurity, I need your help with this," and you're like, "This is exactly what I want to be doing." What would that be?
So I mean, I'm still kind of an identity guy, right, at heart. So personally, maybe that I don't speak for the whole company when I say this, but personally, I like the big identity projects. Nowadays there's not it's not really just identity anymore. You have to be considering access as part of that same
Yep.
project because that's kind of where things have gone over the years, right? It's really about the zero
Especially
trust
Federation.
and
Yeah.
just in time, and so those are all big portions. But I still like the big projects when you kind of get to look at the whole picture.
Have you worked with anything of like identity provisioning on demand for like an ephemeral ID creation?
There are a couple of things in, PIM for groups is something fairly new.
Okay.
So I haven't done much from a client perspective, but I've done a lot of labbing with that. So
Yeah.
that's your, privileged identity group management. And one of the things, it's
Privileged
your
identity. Big.
just-in-time group management based on the privileged identity pieces in Entra. But
Okay.
one of the things it'll allow you to do is do real-time provisioning. So you can add somebody to a group, based on the PIM management as opposed to just the standard access packages, which can be, time-based for an hour, right? You can add somebody to a group for an hour. And that will automatically trigger provisioning to the systems that those are tied to. So you can, theoretically do real-time provisioning for somebody to get access to something that they need and then remove it an hour later, which is kind of cool.
Do you know of any cool like third party, maybe like other vendors or program software that really help or integrate or do some really cool feature that you've been using a lot? It's kind of your go-to in your bag.
Well, I mean, there's definitely some lacking pieces in the Azure application catalog, or maybe it's Entra application catalog at this point. I don't know. So I know
Azure.
that
We're not saying Entra anymore.
okay, the Azure application catalog. So I mean, there's a lot of the HCM systems are one thing, right? So I mean, if you're a company that does it's you're a application creator, and you can create some of your own stuff. And so we've seen some things and actually been introduced to some other companies by Microsoft to say, for instance, you're using Oracle HCM, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no native connector for Oracle HCM, which I don't know why, and they wouldn't have that. Why Microsoft didn't create that themselves, but
yeah,
there are third-party application vendors you can go to, and so yeah, we have something that plugs right in as an enterprise application to the Entra portal and connects right to your Oracle system and brings in all your accounts. So there's some nice things like that
cool.
are good for
So
third party.
let's say you're Batman of identity management, and you have your belt of tools. So your laptop, what are kind of like your personal tools that you like to go to a lot that you find help save you a ton of time or make life a little bit easier for you from just an engineering, day-to-day perspective?
Well, I mean, I use PowerShell, right? In the Microsoft world, you kind of
Do you have a Microsoft tattoo anywhere that we should know about?
But
You
I
love
mean, you
Teams
kind of
too,
have
don't
to, right?
you?
It communicates with everything, and if you need to automate something, I need to take a look at these 1,000 groups and get them created in some other system. It's just something to. It's a good tool, so that's why I like the PowerShell. The ECMA PowerShell connector because of that. Because I know once I get everything into PowerShell, I can do.
You can do whatever you want at that point, right? Nice. Okay, so let's say you want to tell a client 5 things that are looking to either migrate into Azure ID, Entra ID, or they're going to completely skip from a completely different vendor into the new Microsoft world. What would be 5 things that you would tell them to kind of start now to have the most successful rollout possible?
So you have to look at all of your authoritative sources first, right? They think that do you have your HCM systems? You have some kind of other contractor system. What are your sources for everything? And then how do you determine what they need access to? So not just in the cloud, but on-prem, all of your systems that they're going to have to access. And then how do you auto-determine what they have access to? And then how do you figure out, from your access packages, who not just gets them automatically, but who's allowed to have them, right? And everything that goes along with that. And then the next step would be to look at, your privileged things. So how do you monitor your administrative level components and what they have access to and how they actually use that access.
Cool. And then my last question: what's your favorite hacker movie?
What's my favorite what?
Hacker movie.
My favorite Hector movie?
Hacker, like breaking into code.
Hacker.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh man, I don't know. I don't know that I have that.
Okay, I'll give you any movie with a computer in it. What would you say it would be?
Obviously, I like The Matrix. I think everybody likes that.
It's a great movie.
Yeah.
Do you think we're living in the Matrix? Do you think we're living in a simulation right now?
I don't know. It's I guess from a line from the Matrix movies is they tried to make it perfect for everybody and decided people couldn't handle that, right? So they had to bring it back to more of a world that's got faults in it. So I don't know if we were in the matrix, would it be better? I don't know. I guess
If
that's the question.
if there was a Microsoft Entra implantable device that could make kind of like Neuralink that would make you hardwired, would you do it?
I don't know. I haven't been reaching out to Elon to get my head cut open to get his implanted device. So I don't know. I mean, I think that direct interface to some sort of an AI would be kind of impressive. I don't know that that's not really a Microsoft necessarily thing, but
Yeah.
I think that would be interesting. You know, if in my case, getting older, I'd say just a simple, calculator interface would be really nice. It'll do math real time.
That's awesome. Cool, man. Well, hey, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a ton of fun. I've learned a lot because, like I said, I don't know the Microsoft world very well. So these are all questions that have been on my head. I'm sure a lot of other people are pretty interested in this. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell people? Anything that you guys are doing or going to be anywhere that you want to meet up with or anything like that?
No, I just think, this is the thing. This is the next step, right? So whatever you're doing in the identity and access world, you kind of got to be looking at the cloud. And
Cool.
Microsoft, from a cloud perspective, has got some pretty good offerings. So I think it's
So
something
if
you need to
people
be
want to reach out to
considering.
you and get a hold of you, because I'm sure a lot of people have questions, what's the best way to reach you?
You reach me by email. We're looking at setting up some webinars
Hmm.
for the Entra ID governance space. So hopefully we'll have something like that set
Oh,
up
nice.
soon where people
Make
can
sure you
just
invite me.
register and ask questions.
Cool, man. Awesome. Well,
All
thank
right.
you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank
Have
you. I
a
really
great
appreciate
weekend.
you having me
See
on.
you around, man.
You too.